In 1886, a broke, wandering Australian prospector named George Harrison was crossing the high grasslands of the Transvaal in South Africa, heading east toward the alluvial gold diggings of Barberton and Pilgrims, rest in the hope of scraping together enough dust from a streambed to keep himself fed, and his route happened to take him across a stretch of barren farmland owned by Boer settlers. The Dutch-descended farmers who had carved out an independent republic on that remote plateau and wanted nothing more than to be left alone by the British Empire. And on a quiet Sunday morning near a farm called Langlaagte, he noticed an outcrop of strange pebbly rock unlike anything he had seen in the Australian goldfields, chipped a piece off, and found among the oxidized pyrite the unmistakable gleam of gold. He filed his claim with the government of President Paul Kruger in Pretoria, then did something almost impossible to explain. He sold his claim for less than £10 and walked off into obscurity, never seen or heard from again, and what he left behind would reshape the modern world, because the low ridge of hills he had stumbled onto, the Witwatersrand, turned out to sit atop the largest gold deposit ever found on Earth. A formation that over the following century would yield close to 40% of all the gold ever mined by humanity, more than 1.5 billion ounces, a fortune so enormous that it would draw in the most powerful private banking dynasty in the world, fuel the construction of a diamond monopoly, finance an attempted private military coup against a sovereign government, and ultimately place a small London banking house at the very center of the global gold trade for the better part of a century, all while costing tens of thousands of lives, including nearly 27,000 women and children who died in British concentration camps built to break the will of Boer farmers who simply wanted to keep their land. To understand how a farming family's discovery turned into an imperial war, it helps to start not with gold but with diamonds, because in 1867 a child found a 21-carat diamond near the Orange River in the Cape Colony, and within 2 years the region around Kimberley was swallowed by a full-blown diamond rush, with thousands of prospectors tearing up the earth by hand, and among the arrivals was a sickly 17-year-old Englishman named Cecil John Rhodes. The son of a vicar from Bishop Stortford in Hertfordshire, sent to South Africa by doctors who hoped the climate might improve his fragile health. Instead of a recuperative holiday, it became the launching pad for one of the most ruthless careers in the history of capitalism, because Rhodes arrived at the Kimberley Fields in 1871 and immediately understood something the other diggers had missed, that diamonds, unlike gold, have no natural price floor, no industrial anchor, and that their value depends entirely on engineered scarcity, meaning that whoever controlled the pace at which diamonds reached the market controlled their price. Rhodes spent the next 17 years acting on that insight, buying up individual claims one at a time, merging small operations into larger ones, and squeezing out independent diggers, though he lacked the capital to finish the job alone and needed a financial partner capable of operating on a global scale. So sometime in the 1880s he walked into the London offices of N.M. Rothschild and Sons and made his pitch to the most powerful private financial institution on the planet. A firm founded in the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt in the 1760s by Mayor Amschel Rothschild that had spent more than a century building a transnational banking network across 5 European capitals, financing the Duke of Wellington's armies during the Napoleonic Wars, bailing out the Bank of England during the 1825 liquidity crisis, funding railway expansion across the continent, and helping the British government purchase its stake in the Suez Canal. By the 1880s, the London branch was run by Nathaniel Mayer Rothschild, the first Baron Rothschild, known universally as Natty, a methodical and deeply connected man who had become the first Jewish member of the House of Lords, sat on the boards of the Bank of England and other major institutions, and maintained close relationships with senior ministers, colonial administrators, and the architects of British imperial policy. And when Rhodes described his plan to monopolize the global diamond trade from a dusty mining town in southern Africa, Natty listened and wrote the check. Backed by Rothschild capital, Rhodes moved fast, buying out competitors and undercutting rivals, most notably Barney Barnato, a London-born former music hall performer who ran the rival Kimberley Central Diamond Mining Company. And after years of attrition, Rhodes secured a substantial Rothschild loan in 1887 and used it to buy up Barnato's shares until Barnato capitulated. And on the 13th of March 1888, the two companies merged into De Beers Consolidated Mines, with Rhodes as chairman and the Rothschilds as the second largest shareholders, giving the new company control of roughly 90% of the world's rough diamond production within a year, the most successful commercial monopoly the modern world had yet seen, built entirely on Rothschild money. But for both Rhodes and his bankers, diamonds were only a prelude, because when news of the Witwatersrand gold discovery spread through the financial circles of London and Cape Town, it was immediately clear this was no ordinary gold rush. Geological surveys suggested a gold-bearing reef running for dozens of miles beneath the surface, buried deep enough to require industrial-scale mining, heavy machinery, chemical processing, and enormous capital investment. a game suited only to men who could mobilize millions of pounds, men like Rhodes and men like Rothschild, and in 1887 Rhodes registered the gold fields of South Africa Company in London with his brother Thomas as chairman, while Rothschild capital flowed into the venture and gave Rhodes and his allies major stakes in the Witwatersrand mines. The trouble was that the gold sat inside the borders of the South African Republic, the independent Boer nation governed by President Paul Kruger, a deeply conservative Calvinist farmer who remembered the humiliating British defeat at Majuba Hill in the First Boer War of 1880 to 1881, and was determined that his republic would never again be swallowed by the British Empire, and the flood of foreign fortune-seekers who poured into the Transvaal after the gold strike. The so-called Uitlanders alarmed him deeply, since the white population of southern Africa swelled from around 250,000 in 1870 to over 600,000 by 1891, with most of the newcomers' British subjects settling around Johannesburg to work the mines, soon outnumbering the Boers themselves. And Kruger responded by imposing a 14-year residency requirement before Uitlanders could vote, along with heavy mining taxes, government monopolies on essential goods like dynamite, and steep railway tariffs, measures meant to extract revenue from the mines while keeping political control firmly in Boer hands. From Kruger's perspective, this was simple self-preservation, but from the perspective of the mine owners, the men known as the Rand Lords, it was an intolerable drag on their profits, and they wanted a government in Pretoria that was friendly to their interests, with lower taxes, cheaper labor, and reduced transport costs. And behind the Rand Lords stood the Rothschild banking house, whose diamond and gold investments made the political struggle in the Transvaal a matter of direct financial concern to the most powerful bank in London. Rhodes, by this point serving simultaneously as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, and running both De Beers and the Gold Fields Company, concluded that Kruger would never reform and that Uitlanders would never be granted the vote through negotiation. So in 1895 he set in motion one of the most reckless schemes in the history of British imperialism, the Jameson Raid, a plan in which a reform committee of prominent Uitlander businessmen in Johannesburg, financed by figures like Alfred Bate, Lionel Phillips, and the American mining engineer John Hayes Hammond, would stage an uprising inside the Transvaal while roughly 500 armed men from Rhodes's private colonial army, the British South Africa Company, rode across the border from Bechuanaland under the command of his close friend Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, linked up with the Uitlander rebels, and marched on Pretoria to topple Kruger's government in what was supposed to take 3 days, but instead collapsed almost immediately, because when Jameson's column crossed into the Transvaal on the 29th of December 1895, the Boer government already knew about the raid through its intelligence network, having left the telegraph lines to Pretoria intact even as the raiders cut the lines to Cape Town. And Boer commandos shadowed and harassed the column with rifle fire while the promised uprising in Johannesburg never materialized because the Reform Committee lost its nerve. And after 4 sleepless days of running through hostile territory, Jameson's exhausted force was surrounded at a farm called Doornkop just 2 hours from Johannesburg, with 65 men killed or wounded before Jameson surrendered. The political fallout was severe, forcing Rhodes to resign as Prime Minister and lose his directorship of the British South Africa Company, while Jameson was extradited to London, tried and sentenced to 15 months in prison, and Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain, who had quietly approved the raid and even allowed it to stage from British territory, scrambled to distance himself. Though Rhodes held incriminating telegrams proving Chamberlain's foreknowledge, and used them to blackmail him into preserving the British South Africa Company's charter, and the most important consequence of the whole sordid affair was that it confirmed every Boer suspicion about British intentions, prompting Kruger to arm his republic with Mauser rifles and Krupp artillery imported from Germany and France, sending Boer-British relations into a death spiral. With Rhodes publicly disgraced, the task of bringing the Transvaal under British control passed to a new and far more patient and dangerous figure, Alfred Milner, born in Germany in 1854 but raised and educated in England, a graduate of Balliol College, Oxford, a former journalist and civil servant in Egypt, and a political operator of exceptional skill, who was appointed British High Commissioner for South Africa and Governor of the Cape Colony in 1897 on the recommendation of powerful figures in London who wanted a steady hand willing to push events toward a particular conclusion, and Milner's private correspondence, preserved at the Bodleian Library at Oxford, reveals a man who arrived believing the Transvaal could never remain independent while it controlled the richest goldfields on earth, and that war was the most efficient way to resolve the situation, describing his own approach not as diplomacy but as deliberate provocation, amplifying the Uitlander grievance over voting rights far beyond its real significance, pressuring the colonial office toward an increasingly aggressive posture. and rejecting Boer concessions that by any reasonable standard should have satisfied British demands, including Kruger's offer to reduce the voting residency requirement from 14 years to 5, which Milner dismissed before moving the goalposts again, since he was not negotiating in good faith but manufacturing a crisis that would make war unavoidable, and behind Milner stood the same network that had backed Rhodes. With Lord Rothschild maintaining close contact with both Milner and the colonial administration, the same mining magnates who had financed the Jameson Raid's Reform Committee still operating in Johannesburg and pressing for political change, and Rhodes himself, though publicly disgraced, remaining influential behind the scenes as part of a small circle that included Milner, Lord Rothschild, and the journalist William T. Stead, all of whom shared a vision of expanding British imperial control across southern Africa and eventually uniting the English-speaking world under a federal structure. Through the summer of 1899, tensions escalated relentlessly, with British troop reinforcements quietly dispatched to South Africa, even as Chamberlain publicly hinted that a settlement was near, a deliberate deception that the Boers could see through as they watched the military build up on their borders. And on the 9th of October 1899, the Transvaal government issued an ultimatum demanding British troop withdrawal from the frontier, and when it expired unanswered, the Second Boer War began. What followed was one of the most brutal and costly conflicts in the history of the British Empire, fought not by a professional Boer army but by farmers, cattlemen, shopkeepers, and preachers who rode as mounted commandos, using their knowledge of the terrain, their marksmanship, and their mobility to inflict devastating losses on British regulars, besieging British garrisons at Ladysmith, Kimberley, and Mafeking in the opening months. With Rhodes himself traveling to Kimberley and placing himself inside the besieged city to pressure the British military into diverting resources toward relieving him rather than pursuing more strategically important objectives. And in December 1899, the British suffered a catastrophic string of defeats known as Black Week, with losses at Stormberg, Madgersfontein, and Colenso, prompting London to pour in reinforcements until nearly 450,000 British and colonial troops were deployed against a Boer force that never exceeded about 40,000 fighting men. By mid-1900, the conventional phase of the war was effectively over, with Johannesburg and Pretoria captured and Kruger fled into exile, but the Boers refused to surrender, dissolving instead into the countryside to wage a guerrilla campaign that dragged on for 2 more years, and the British response was systematic and merciless, with Lord Kitchener adopting a scorched earth policy that saw thousands of Boer farms burned to the ground, livestock slaughtered, wells poisoned, crops destroyed. And the civilian population, women, children, and elderly men unable to fight, rounded up into what the British called concentration camps, a term that entered the common vocabulary of warfare for the first time in this conflict. And conditions inside these camps were atrocious, as documented by Emily Hobhouse, a British welfare campaigner and daughter of a Cornish Anglican rector who traveled to South Africa in December 1900. Secured permission to visit the camp at Bloemfontein, and found roughly 2,000 people crowded onto a barren hillside with inadequate shelter, insufficient food rations, virtually no medical care, and children dying of measles, typhoid, pneumonia, and simple malnutrition, all of which she reported back to the British government and public despite being initially dismissed as a Boer sympathizer and troublemaker by officials including Milner himself. Until the government's own investigative body, the Fawcett Commission led by suffragist Millicent Garrett Fawcett, confirmed everything Hobhouse had documented, and the final death toll was staggering, with nearly 28,000 Boer civilians dying in the camps, the vast majority of them children under 16, alongside an estimated 14,000 or more Black African internees who perished in separate camps, meaning roughly 1 in 4 Boer camp inmates died, mostly from preventable disease aggravated by starvation and neglect, one of the most shameful episodes in British military history, denounced in London by Liberal opposition leader Henry Campbell Bannerman, who called the British tactics methods of barbarism, and by the future Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who accused the government of pursuing a policy of extermination, turning public opinion in Britain and across Europe sharply against the war even as the military campaign ground relentlessly on, until the last Boer fighters surrendered in late May 1902, leading to the signing of the Treaty of Vereeniging in Pretoria on the 31st of May, under terms that were presented as generous. The Boers would lay down arms and swear allegiance to the British Crown in exchange for amnesty, continued use of the Dutch language in schools and courts, £3 million for reconstruction, and the promise of eventual limited self-government, which arrived in 1906 and 1907, before the former Boer republics were folded into the Union of South Africa in 1910. But crucially, the treaty said nothing about the political rights of Black Africans, since both the British and the Boers agreed without discussion that the new political order would rest on white minority rule, laying the foundations of the apartheid system that would dominate South Africa for the next century. And the real question beneath all the rhetoric about Uitlander rights and imperial prestige is simpler and colder than any of it. who got the gold, because just 4 days after the peace treaty was signed, the first gold mine on the Witwatersrand reopened, and Alfred Milner, the man who had engineered the diplomatic crisis that made the war inevitable, became administrator of the conquered Boer territories, filling key government posts with his own protégés. A group of young, Oxford-educated men who became known as Milner's Kindergarten, who restructured the mining laws, reduced labor costs by importing indentured Chinese laborers, and ensured the gold flowed unimpeded into the hands of the mining companies and their London-based financial backers. And the Rothschild connection to South African gold did not end with the war but deepened. Since N.M. Rothschild and Sons had already been the second largest shareholder in De Beers and held stakes in Witwatersrand gold operations for decades, and after the war with the mines back in full operation and South Africa firmly under British control, the Rothschilds assumed an even more central role in the global gold trade when in 1919, the Bank of England established the London gold fixing. A daily ritual in which a small group of bullion dealers meeting in a private room would set the world price of gold, and the institution chosen to host and chair this ritual was N.M. Rothschild and Sons, with the first gold fixing taking place on the 12th of September 1919 at the Rothschild offices on St. Swithin's Lane in the City of London, attended by 5 firms, N.M. Rothschild, Makeda and Goldsmith, Pixley and Abel, Samuel Montagu and Sharps Wilkins. With the chairmanship permanently held by the Rothschild representative for the next 85 years, and the gold whose price they were fixing came overwhelmingly from South Africa, since the Bank of England had specifically negotiated what was called the July Agreement, guaranteeing that South African mining companies would market their gold through London, with N.M. Rothschild and Sons designated as the South African gold industry's agent in the city. An elegant system in which gold mined from the Witwatersrand was shipped to London, refined at the Royal Mint Refinery, which the Rothschild family had leased since 1852, and then sold through the gold fixing at a price set in the wood-paneled room at New Court, meaning that for decades more than a third of the world's newly mined gold passed through a single mechanism with the Rothschilds sitting permanently at its center. The culmination of a strategy built over half a century in which Rothschild money financed the man who built the diamond monopoly, backed the mining operations that made the Witwatersrand goldfields economically viable, and saw its associates help engineer the political conditions that led to war, so that when the fighting ended and the concentration camps closed and the debts were buried, the Rothschild banking house was sitting in the chairman's seat setting the world price of the very gold that had been the prize all along. It is worth being precise about what is documented and what is interpretation here, because there is no single piece of paper in the Rothschild archives declaring an intent to start a war for gold. That is simply not how power at this level operates, but the documentary record does show a clear pattern. Rothschild money built De Beers, Rothschild money backed Rhodes, Rhodes organized the Jameson Raid, and when that raid failed, Milner was installed and his own private letters show he deliberately provoked the war that followed, a war that destroyed the Boer republics and transferred the Witwatersrand goldfields to British control. After which the Rothschild banking house became the permanent chair of the very mechanism that set the world price of that gold. The human cost of all this extended far beyond any balance sheet, since the Boer War killed nearly 100,000 people, destroyed some 32,000 Boer farms, razed 25 towns and 20 villages along with their churches, pioneered the use of concentration camps as a tool of counterinsurgency, entrenched a racial hierarchy that would evolve into apartheid, and permanently reshaped the architecture of the global gold market around a small cluster of London institutions. And Cecil Rhodes himself died on the 26th of March 1902, just 2 months before the war ended, at only 48 years old, his health broken and his reputation permanently damaged by the Jameson Raid, leaving his fortune to fund the continued expansion of British imperial influence, including the Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, which still exists today as perhaps the most visible monument to a career built on Rothschild money and ambitions that required a war to fulfill. While Natty Rothschild outlived him by 13 years, dying in 1915 during the first year of the Great War that would ironically begin eroding Rothschild dominance over European state finance, though by then the South African gold machine was already running smoothly, the mines producing, the gold flowing to London, and the price being set twice a day in that small room on St. Swithin's Lane, beneath portraits of the crowned heads of Europe who had once been the family's clients. Each dealer seated at a small desk with a telephone, and a miniature Union Jack flag raised when buying and lowered when finished, a quiet, orderly, and extraordinarily profitable ritual that the Rothschild family maintained the chairmanship of until 2004, when N.M. Rothschild and Sons withdrew from gold trading altogether, handing the role to Barclays Capital, and turning what had been a permanent 85-year Rothschild chairmanship into a rotating annual position. A quiet exit that barely made the news but marked the end of a story that began with a sick teenager arriving at the Kimberley Diamond Fields in 1871, backed by a check from the most powerful bank in the world. Today, South Africa's gold industry is a shadow of what it once was, With the Witwatersrand mines in decline since the 1970s, many of the deepest shafts closed and flooded with acid water that seeps into the groundwater and poisons surrounding communities. The landscape around Johannesburg scarred by enormous mounds of mine tailings left over from a century of extraction, while the wealth pulled from beneath those Boer farms flowed overwhelmingly to London, to the mining houses, the banks, and the shareholders who never set foot on African soil, and the Boer farmers who once owned that land, received a reconstruction grant of £3 million, a sum that by any honest accounting was a fraction of the wealth extracted, while the black African population, whose labor had been essential to the mining industry and who suffered enormously during the war, received nothing at all, deliberately excluded from the political settlement of Vereeniging and forced to wait 92 years. Until 1994, before they could vote in their own country. There's a tendency in historical narratives to present events like the Boer War as the inevitable product of impersonal forces, the clash of empires, the logic of industrialization, the irresistible pull of mineral wealth, and there is some truth in that framing, but it obscures the fact that behind every so-called impersonal force, there were specific individuals making specific decisions for specific reasons. A specific banker who wrote a specific check to a specific young man in Kimberley, a specific raid organized by specific people for the specific purpose of overthrowing a sovereign government, a specific diplomat who in his own private letters described engineering the conditions for a specific war, and a specific banking house that once the war was over and the gold was flowing, sat down in a specific room in the city of London and began setting the price. Because the Boer War was not some distant colonial conflict fought over abstractions, but a war fought over gold and diamonds, financed by private capital, engineered by men who understood exactly what they were doing and why, leaving behind an enormous human cost concentrated into financial rewards for a very small number of hands, and an architecture of power, the mining monopolies, the financial institutions, the racial hierarchies, the mechanisms of global commodity pricing. That continues to shape the world in ways most people never think about, so that when you look at a gold bar, a diamond ring, the skyline of Johannesburg, or the financial institutions of the City of London, you are looking at the legacy of decisions made in boardrooms and banking houses more than a century ago. Decisions that sent armies across oceans, burned farms and poisoned wells, locked women and children behind barbed wire, and built fortunes of almost incomprehensible scale. And while the family whose capital set it all in motion, quietly folded its little flag on the desk on St. Swithin's Lane in 2004 and moved on to other things, the mines kept producing for a while, the gold kept flowing and the price kept being set, and the fingerprints of that original arrangement, Rothschild money, Rhodes's ambition, Milner's cold diplomacy, and the deaths of thousands of children in the concentration camps, remain visible today for anyone who knows where to look. Which is perhaps the most important lesson of the whole story. Not that powerful people do terrible things, since that is hardly news, but that the mechanisms built to profit from those terrible things have a way of outlasting the people who built them, becoming permanent, unquestioned features of the landscape, accepted as natural by generations who have long forgotten how, and at whose expense they were created.